Shalom, 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 everybody. How y'all doing? Welcome, welcome, welcome. Come on in. Come on in. Tell your friend. Bring your kin. Sit yourself, get your popcorn, your drink, and get ready for us to begin. What a thing, what a thing, what a thing. We're on chapter 3. We're about to finish off chapter 3 tonight. Chapter 3 of On the Real Side by Mr. Mel Watkins. History of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. We in that thing, man. So we read section 1 and section 2 last night, which was a great read, man. A great flow, great, read. It's kind of late right now, so probably won't be, nobody alive. But we're gonna go ahead and finish off chapter 3 tonight. It's pretty, I'm not gonna say long, but about 7 pages. 7 pages for section 3, so we can go ahead and finish it off. I should have read earlier, but I was caught up in the YouTube shenanigans. But we in here. We in here tonight, and we're going to finish it. We're going to finish it so we can move on. One page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time, one book at a time until we go ahead and expand our mind. Yeah. And see if there's anything that we can learn and grow from in any of these books that we read, or any of the books that I read and that you follow along with me, or listen attentively to see if there's something that you can learn and grow from in these books. Definitely been some interesting things for me, some interesting facts, or historical facts, points, viewpoints, vantage points, here a little, there a little. Yeah, man, But, it is what it is. It is what it is. But we're moving right along. Look at all that, man. Look at all what we have gotten through. We in there. Chapter 3 is called The Minstrelsy. The Minstrelsy to Vaudeville. Black minstrelsy to vaudeville. Black on black. So far, this chapter has been going into a lot of, key players in the beginning of the comedic experience, I guess. Definitely in the minstrel show. People who went with the minstrel troops like Kerr Sands and Lucas, Sam Lucas, Billy Kerr Sands. Let me see another man named John Hewlett, Ira Eldridge. Oh, that was Billy Kerr Sands. And at the beginning of the chapter, that's Billy. Old Billy Kerr Sands right now. He definitely said he was one to watch. How we have our people to watch for today, like Dave Chappelle. I think Dave Chappelle would be one of the ones. At his time, Richard Pryor, Red Fox. I think they had, some of the same significance that maybe Billy Kerr Sands may have had. People would be like, Chappelle not dancing, literally, maybe figuratively, but, the same stage presence that they probably had, to command the stage and garner people's attentions. Pretty sure they will stand up to that today. But any words I don't know or stumble through, can't pronounce, feel like I can't pronounce, I will look them up. Welcome to all the new people. Welcome back to all the, loyal subscribers. Let's keep the channel growing. Let's keep going. and see if we can keep pushing our knowledge to escalate to greater heights and heights. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Let's get started and finish off chapter 3 tonight. Chapter 3 of the On the Real Side by Mel Watkins. Black Minstrelsy to Vaudeville. Section 3. Overall, Black minstrelsy introduced an ironic new competent component to America's popular entertainment. If the sight of whites disguising themselves as blacks and distorting their own music, dance, and humor was bizarre, the phenomenon of non-white performers blackening their already dark faces and imitating the grotesque antics of their white impersonators was even more outlandish. But the travesty did not end there. For the outset, troupes with black performers were advertised and promoted as the real thing. Frank Queen, editor of The Clipper, a contemporary entertainment newspaper, bluntly referred to them as real nigs. Black troupes were also emphasized their link to plantation life and often referred to their companies as slave troupes. They were so successful at this that critics and journalists frequently praised their authenticity. A New York newspaper called the Brooker and Clayton Troupe genuine plantation darkies from the South and hailed them as great delineators of the darker life, who vigorously showcased the peculiar music and characteristics of plantation life. Black minstrel shows were seen as real life scenarios in which the participants engaged in their normal behavior, revealed their childlike, irresponsible natures, and unleashed their natural inclination towards song, dance, and comedy, as well as their primitive passions. Black minstrelsy was regarded not as performance, but as a kind of peep show that offered an unobscured view of Negroes in their natural and preferred environment, servitude, and the Southern plantation. Incessant advertising and promotion, as well as long-standing stereotypes of blacks, enhanced the illusion. Moreover, the political and social circumstances of the time reinforced white audiences' quick and generally unquestioned acceptance of the fantasy. Black minstrelsy emerged as a viable and profitable entertainment venture near the end of the Reconstruction period of 1867 to 1877. When America grappled with the question of how to treat thousands of newly freed blacks, the period began in The period began on a positive note when the Civil Rights Act of 1866 made blacks full citizens and promised them equal treatment under the law. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 and its three subsequent refinements sought to ensure protection for the political rights of black citizens. For a brief period, in the United States Army was used to former Confederate states to guarantee that freedmen's rights were upheld. Most blacks responded to the challenge and full citizenship in the positive manner. With their newly granted voting rights, ex-slaves were the decisive factor in the election of many progressive lawmakers, including the first African American public officials. Several black Americans became lieutenant governors of the southern states. Others served as treasurers, speakers of the House, state and U.S. representatives. Two, Hiram R. Revels and Blanche K. Bruce, both of Mississippi, were elected to the U.S. Senate, despite strident claims about their mongrelization of government and determined resistance by white officials, these black lawmakers and officials helped initiate progressive social and educational programs intended to benefit both blacks and white citizens. From the start, however, most white Southerners resented the idea of equal rights for their former slaves. Active resistance to nearly all black participation in government and society began immediately. Black codes, known as the Jim Crow laws, were enacted in many Confederate states soon after the Civil War. These ordinances, aimed specifically at blacks, were supposedly intended to guard them, freedmen, and the state against any evils that might arise from their sudden emancipation. In reality, they not only segregated blacks socially, public facilities, education, etc., but also limited their right to vote and seek protection under the law. When whites were involved and produced were what? When whites were involved and prescribed where they could live and work, and in some instances, when and if they could leave certain areas without the written consent of whites. Oh man, where is your hall pass? Where is your hall pass? Nigga. In addition, to further guard against black upstarts who believed that emancipation might meant freedom in any true sense or equality in any sense whatsoever, America's most infamous vigilant group emerged in the South. The Ku Klux Klan began innocently enough when 6 former Confederate soldiers in Pulaski, Tennessee, decided that they needed some activities to replace the excitement and adventure they had experienced during the war. In May of 1866, they formed the Social Club. The name of the club was taken from Ku Klux Adelphon, Ku Klux Adelphon, a Greek letter fraternity on college campuses. The phrase means circle of brothers in Greek. Hence, the organization was called the Ku Klux Klan. Initially, the secret rituals, and the strange hooded costumes were innocuous incidentals intended to add mystery and allure to a frivolous social club. As the club grew, however, it quickly shed its harmless image. Enraged about the establishment of schools to educate blacks, members of the Athens, Alabama faction of the Klan took matters into their own hands and disciplined one of the students soon after. Soon afterwards, they announced that maintaining white supremacy was one of their primary aims. The Klan had stumbled upon a goal that had instant appeal for many Southerners. Klan membership, Bergen. What is this word, man? Let's mark it. Let's see. I know I'm saying it wrong. Whatever it is, I think it means it exploded. BURGENED. Let's see how to pronounce this. Excuse me. BURGEONED. Bergen. Virgin. Virgin. Begin to grow or increase rapidly, flourish. Klan membership began to grow rapidly. Klan membership began to flourish. Klan membership burgeoned. And the club spread to all of the former Confederate states. An organization of thrill-seeking pranksters had been transformed into a terrorist group dedicated to keeping blacks and other minorities in their place. In April of 1868, an unsigned letter from one of the 6 original Klan members appeared in the Citizen, the Pulaski newspaper. The simple object of the original Ku Kluxes, it read, had become perverted, but the Ku Klux had never been heard of. Faced with legislative and vigilant opposition, ex-slaves found themselves in a bewildering, if not impossible, situation. Generally, without physical resources or education, most found it difficult to sustain them even a bare sustenance level. A few, through either their own almost Herculean individual efforts or the generosity of their former masters, managed to secure property and establish lives as independent landowners. Some, the forerunners of the vast migration that would occur near the end of the century, left their rural homes and set out for urban areas. Most of them were less prepared for poverty in urban ghettos than they had been in destitution in the rural South. Many fell victim to the degradation of slum living and the white northern populace that resented their presence. Others remained in the South and determined to exercise their freedom, but unprepared and unable legitimately to provide for themselves, took to theft and debauchery as a way of life. Most settled into lives of sharecropping on plantations and farms owned by their previous masters, where they found that bondage was not limited to chattel slavery. With emancipation, discrimination in America had shifted from an ostensible class or caste basis, master to slave, to a frankly racial bias, white to black. Blacks were free, technically, but very few white Americans seriously contemplated a society in which they would live and work side by side with their former slaves. Perhaps even more than during slavery, white America needed justification for the subordination and repression of an ethnic group that had become its supposed social and legal equal. It was against this social backdrop that blacks emerged as comic entertainers on the American popular stage. Unfortunately, a distorted black specter already dominated the stage, and initially, blacks had no choice but to reaffirm it. In so doing, they also helped provide superficial justification for the racial repression that marked the late 19th century America. It is easy to understand why white audiences continued to flock to minstrel shows during this period. Freed blacks posed a substantial threat to most whites, not so much a physical as a psychological menace, and as competition in the labor market. Both white and black minstrels provided a source of comfort and reassurance to white audiences. On the other hand, the black audience's positive response to minstrelsy has always prompted debate. Many commentators insist that black participation in the minstrel phenomenon, both as audience and performer, suggests a conspiratorial connection, a kind of guilt by association. For instance, Nathan Huggins wrote that to watch a slow-witted blackface incompetent on stage or a Negro who stumbles through foolish predicaments is at once to recognize an identity and to assume a superiority as viewer and critic. Comparing blacks who laugh at black ineptitude on the minstrel stage with Jews who were amused by the antics of the traditional green horn on the Yiddish stage, Huggins concludes. It is all of kind of masochism, which converts self-hatred through its indulgence into gratification and the pleasure of self-esteem. But the rub is that the contempt for self and race on which such humor turns must be ever present at work to make it work. His interpretation is a turn on the familiar, laughter through tears assessment of ethic humor. But even though there is some validity to the catchy street axiom, you have to be one to know one. Identifying with the ethnic group being satirized is not a prerequisite for being amused and made to feel superior by ethnic humor. In fact, those most amused are usually clearly outside the target group. After all, as spectators rather than participants, blacks had virtually no impact on the popularity of minstrelsy as performed by white entertainers. Minstrelsy was created by white performers for the entertainment of white audiences. In antebellum America, most blacks were still in bondage, and few freedmen could have afforded such entertainment if they were welcomed or indeed if imposed. When black performers ventured into minstrelsy, however, black audiences became a central factor in the success or failure of a troupe. In fact, blacks became the primary audiences for most black minstrel shows. Initially, the large white-owned troupes that provided plantation extravaganzas usually played in urban areas before mostly white audiences. These lavish shows were originally intended for whites, although the lure of seeing real black performers attracted many blacks and occasionally caused theater owners to modify the practice of barring blacks or seating them only in a small roped off section of the gallery, which was dubbed nigger heaven. Ooh, we in nigger heaven now. We's here with these white folks. In 1873, for instance, a Clipper correspondent in New Orleans reported Calendar's minstrels were viewed by a substantial audience, largely composed of colored people who were attracted to by the novelty of the chorus of real nigger performers. In Cleveland, the Calendar troupe attracted a black audience that took possession of dress circle and galleries. There were similar reports about black attendance at other performances by the white-owned troops. In the South, Billy Cursan's was so popular that, according to Tom Fletcher, owners often would split accommodations in half. Prejudice was half forgotten as owners arranged for colored customers to accompany a full half of the theater from the ground floor or orchestra section right up to the gallery, with whites filling the other side. From the outset, blacks comprised the majority audience, comprised the majority audience for the smaller black-owned minstrel troupes. Hicks and Heights Georgia minstrels were characterized as being very popular amongst Washington, D.C. blacks as early as 1869, and a few years later in Pittsburgh, the colored element of the city reportedly turned out en masse to see Hicks' Georgia slave troupe. And for the duration of the minstrelsy, small companies operated by blacks such as Lou Johnson, William McCabe, Pat Chappell, and of course Hicks, Cursans, and Hogan, before his rise to stardom as a vaudeville entertainer, performed before largely black audiences. Robert Toll concludes, it seems that black minstrels drew primarily black common people, and the scat evidence available suggests that he is correct. In the 19th century, middle-class blacks as well as black intellectuals either ignored or actively criticized black minstrels. As W.C. Handy observed, they generally saw black minstrels as a disreputable lot. Their estimate of minstrelsy foreshadowed an attitude implicit in W.E.B. Du Bois' concept of the talented tenth, advanced at the turn of the century. Like Du Bois, they believed that to overcome segregation and racism, they should emphasize the accomplishments of the small, educated, and polite segment of the Black community. Even legitimate aspects of the Black folk culture, work songs, spiritual music, as sung by the masses, nearly all dances assumed to be related to African sources were denounced and labeled vulgar. Minstrelsy and concisely distorted white caricature of Black behavior was treated more contemptuously since it pointedly lampooned behavior that was intended to characterize all Blacks. The boys put it quite simply: the more highly trained we become, the less we can laugh at Negro comedy. Excuse me. Let me hold on. Let me run right quick. I need something to drink. Let me mark my spot. Give me a second, and I'm gonna go run grab me something to drink, and I'll be right back. My bad. I normally have my drink before I start reading, but I thought I was gonna be able to pull it off. All right, all right. Woo-wee. See if I can make this last. All right. The Black middle class, perhaps even more zealously than most white Americans, accepted and aspired to European standards of taste and behavior. More important, these Blacks urgently sought to disassociate themselves from the stereotypical image of common Black folks, thinking this would hasten their acceptance in mainstream society. Conversely, the Black masses, primarily recently freed slaves, apparently saw no reason to fashion either their behavior or their choice of entertainment on the basis of what whites might think. In all probability, they attended minstrel shows for many of the same reasons and were amused by the same things as whites. Politics of race aside, minstrel shows, despite their decidedly low order of humor, were the period's most popular form of entertainment. Moreover, the audiences they attracted were Black, whether Black or white, were drawn primarily from the lower levels of society. Minstrelsy never had much appeal among the polite or intellectual segment of society, despite such well-known exceptions as Mark Twain and Charles Dickens. Of course, minstrelsy's primary attraction for Black audiences was the opportunity to see other Blacks perform. Billy Cursands, Sam Lucas, Tom McIntosh, Tom Fletcher, and other Black minstrels were celebrities in Black communities, like the athletes and politicians who rose to prominence in the late 19th century. Black jockeys and trainers, for instance, excelled in racing until after 1894, when the newly formed Jockey Club began systematically eliminating them from the sport. They were living reminders that it was possible to escape at least partially the poverty and degradation that was so common among Blacks. Moreover, Blacks who attended minstrel shows apparently laughed as much or even more heartily at the performers' antics than did whites. This reaction did and in fact still does confound some observers. In 1891, for instance, In 1891, for instance, a white reporter criticized a performance by Tom McIntosh because the comic, in the manner of Billy Curzon's, centered his act on facial contortions and mouthing, which were neither funny nor pleasing. Still, a goodly number of colored people in the New York City audience seemed to vastly enjoy the ludicrous portion of the program. The writer's reaction reflects not only his estimate of McIntosh's act, but also his puzzlement over blacks not being offended. This reaction to some black comedy persisted from minstrelsy through the Amos and Andy show and many present-day sitcoms. The criticism is largely unfounded since the blacks attended the performance, unlike the white reviewer or many intellectual blacks who usually avoided these shows, were not concerned with the effect of the comic act on white society's estimate of black people. Most likely, like the crowd of people with whom I gathered in the privacy of a neighbor's house to watch eagerly the adventures of Amos, Sapphire, and Kingfish in the late 1950s, they took the performance at face value. They did not view it with one eye focused on white opinion. And from that perspective, black minstrelsy, despite its original intent and however inept and distorted its portrayal of authentic black humor, may well have been entertaining to black audiences. Comic performances are partially dependent on the comedian establishing a rapport with the audience. And for the mostly downtrodden black audiences who flocked to see Curzon's, Lucas, and others, there was an immediate bond. Minstrelsies may have been far-fetched, but it did feature black performers who, despite the political or social implications of their stage routines, provided a rare vision of legitimate celebrities with whom they could identify. The black mass's authentic endorsement of minstrelsy is often construed as evidence of wholesome black capitulation to the degradatory mainstream images of themselves and, consequently, of blacks having a self-degrading outlook that is reflected in their humor. And in fact, the question is how deeply or pervasively the meaning of minstrel stereotypes affected African Americans' character remains a complex and troubling matter. Stereotypes, after all, are not created from mere air. Many of the customs and behavioral traits that, after being exaggerated and burlesqued, were attributed to blacks, did have their roots in the West African territories, where most slaves were seized. It is no secret that, for instance, that in many African societies, religious ceremonies encouraged more demonstrative behavior than was acceptable in the Catholic and Protestant rituals of America's European settlers. Ooh. In addition, the emphasis on rhythm in African music, which is commonly believed to elicit a physical response from listeners, induced more effusive responses than most European music, which emphasized melody and harmony. Similarly, climate and ritual dictated the African dress in a manner that no doubt shocked Europeans, whose religion and customs demanded that they shun any public bodily display. The Protestant ethic is defined and extolled in Europe. The rigid instance that hard work and personal restraint were the keys to individual success and happiness was not as highly regarded in African communities. Although no less demanding, the work ethic in most African societies had a tribal communal basis. Behavioral traits stemming from these and other cultural and environmental differences provided the grist for white America's propaganda and parodic meal. Therefore, while some are loath to admit it, Many characteristics attributed to blacks, although grossly distorted by white Americans, had some basis in black Americans' African heritage. Ooh-wee. Yeah. At the same time, unlike most whites, black audiences knew that black life was much richer and more diverse than the one-dimensional portrayal of happy-go-lucky simpletons that minstrelsy presented. This is not surprising, since incongruity is the central element in nearly all humor. We laugh because of our awareness of the disparity between a perceived action and what we know is possible for us. A joke focused, excuse me, on a black comic's ravenous consumption of a watermelon, or on his assertive misuse of syllabic words, loses most of its humorous overtones if the listener is incapable of recognizing that one may eat in a less demonstrative manner or speak properly. In fact, one might reasonably argue that educated blacks' inability to laugh at minstrel exaggeration reflected some paranoia and self-doubt among themselves. Normally, the ability to laugh, even when the joke is at one's own expense, is a sigh of assurance and confidence. Of course, the racist environment of late 19th century America was far from reasonable or normal. And contrary to the maxim made famous by Flip Wilson's female stage persona, the emulent common woman, Geraldine, during that time, what you saw was not necessarily what you got. Educated blacks responded to minstrelsy by reacting as much to what they knew whites saw in it as to what was presented on stage. They denounced it because they understood that mainstream America saw the stage Negro as the essential black person. They wanted no part of that equation. Their adamant denial was partly a personal matter, but it was also politically and socially motivated. Although in the privacy of their own homes, they probably did find some humor in minstrelsy, outlandish farces. Publicly, they felt compelled to condemn it. And in so doing, they broadened the rift between blacks' public and private reaction to black stage humor. But the black masses' enjoyment of the minstrelsy did not imply any internalization of the stereotypes presented. In fact, their response may be seen as an affirmation of cultural values that, while deprecated by the larger society, had been covertly extolled by blacks since arriving in America. Many, no doubt, looked upon mainstream society's restrained behavior with amused irreverence. Ooh, good lemonade. Without education or the indoctrination in mainstream values that would begin surfacing in second and third generation freedmen, the ex-slaves and first generation freedmen who enjoyed minstrelsy seemingly took it for what it was: comic exaggeration of behavioral traits that they esteemed. A more flamboyantly overt reemergence of the identification with these behavioral traits would be seen in the 20th century during the 20s Harlem Renaissance, the 70s Black Power movement, and to some extent in the instantly ghettoized style of the 90s rap music and assertive in-your-face comedy. Moreover, as the historian Paul Oliver suggests, black entertainers, by adopting the burnt cork or soot and flour makeup of minstrel shows may have clearly shown that minstrelsy was a vehicle for satire and helped diffuse charges of African American inferiority. Without doubt, minstrelsy did establish a set of derogatory racial stereotypes in American humor. These not only became standard elements of popular stage humor and later radio, film, and television humor, but also common reference in the everyday humor of nearly all Americans, blacks included. Just as some popular minstrel songs, originally inspired by black styles but composed in a European idiom, were adopted by blacks and subjected to a folk reinterpretation, many stereotypes introduced in anti-black jokes were incorporated into black humor. Watermelon jokes, coon jokes, jokes about blacks' odors, appearance, big lips, wide nose, dark skin, nappy hair, etc. Simple-mindedness, trickiness, brutishness, cowardness, ungainliness, carnality, and laziness, although not all exclusively created by minstrels, were indelibly etched into the American psyche by minstrel performers. But just as many saccharine minstrel tunes were altered and revitalized when subjected to a black folk interpretation, many racist jokes and gags from the minstrel stage were subtly transformed when adopted by the black community in the late 19th century. Still, documentation of the private humor of blacks during any period before the mid 20th century is scant, particularly from the Civil War to the 1920s. Slave narratives and folklore collections afforded adequate examples of antebellum black humor. The beginning with the Harlem Renaissance, the increased publication of fiction and biographies by blacks, as well as newspaper accounts and interviews with blacks of the period, provide ample illustrations of private black humor. From Reconstruction to the early 20th century, however, with the exception of scattered and limited folklore collections, few examples of everyday thoughts or humor of blacks exist. Historians, for the most part, were not interested in the private diversions and amusements of common black folks, and even if they had been, as were seen, distrust of whites had made secrecy, deception, and a guarded attitude about nearly all authentic details of life fundamental tenets in the black community. The social condition of blacks, their travails under the yoke of Southern repressions and racism, dominated the works of the few black writers published during the period. Although Charles W. Chestnut is a prominent exception, there is little or no humor in the writing of the talented 10th authors such as Sutton Griggs, W.E.B. Du Bois, and James Weldon Johnson. Their works may be fairly characterized as overwhelmingly serious and polemical. 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 Let's look it up. Polemical. 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 And Paul Laurence Dunbar's fiction, although humorous, most often reflected the stereotypical minstrel image of Negroes and the prevailing plantation literary tradition of the time more than an authentic portrait of black life. The folklorish and poet Salters Redding suggested that Dunbar's popularity was based more on his portrayal of the charming, light-hearted darky than on literary. Ooh-wee. One can only assume that, like the slavery humor that preceded the period and the Harlem Renaissance humor that followed it, private black humor of the late 19th and early 20th century displayed an ironic, double-edged attitude towards white society and blacks' positions in it. Gilbert Ossowski suggests as much in the introduction to Putting on Old Massa, a collection of slave narratives, when he writes, I have been impressed by the way in which so much of the tone of late 19th and 20th century black folk stories and jokes around slavery simply repeat the substance of recorded slave humor of the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. Perhaps we have the continuation of an oral tradition whose roots are centuries old. One can safely assume that the same oral tradition that permitted aspects of African humor to survive in America during the 18th and early 19th century was sustained through the years following the war until the 1920s. It is quite probable that in everyday verbal games, such as signifying those 19th century freedmen like slaves before them, the teenagers with whom I grew up with in the 1950s, and no doubt much of today's youth, use derogatory racial epithets and jokes that might have been seen in the most anti-black minstrel routine. Given the borrowing that characterized minstrelsy, some of those jokes may even have originated among blacks. When used by blacks, however, the intent and often the meaning of the gag or epithet would likely have been altered. In minstrelsy, for example, disparaging jokes about blacks most often had a general target. That is, the comic reproach was markedly racist and aimed at all blacks, for instance. Niggas' hair am very short. White folks' hair am longer. White folks, they smell very strong. Niggas, they smell stronger. But when privately engaging in this type of ridicule, blacks typically refer to the specific person. In fact, the speaker usually clearly distinguishes him or herself from the traits or characteristics being mocked, even though the speaker may more obviously display the physical traits being ridiculed than the target does. A common turn on the above rib might simply be, white folks may smell strong, but niggas, you smell stronger. Moreover, as these familiar with black street language know, the meaning of most words or phrases depends on the speaker's intonation and the content in which a remark occurs. Again, in black culture, what you see is usually not what you get. Although blacks adopted many of these epithets and reference of minstrel humor, they did not necessarily accept the general racist connotations. This common alteration of the meaning and racial epithets and jokes within the black community is also largely responsible for the typical misunderstanding of blacks' private humor. On the simplest level, it may be seen in outsiders' bewilderment at blacks casually referring to one another as nigger, but being outraged if the term is used by non-blacks. The term nigger, although presently out of favor, may denote anything from a close, respected friend to a disposed reprobate, from the positive, that's a bad nigger, to the negative, what is that nigger doing? While the term is almost always used in a negative manner by whites, its use in a joke or apparently racial slur by blacks needs a subtle analysis. On a more complex level, this private alteration of public stereotypes results in an erroneous and perverse assumption by social scientists and commentators that blacks embrace the derogatory mainstream meaning of the epithets they use. The misinterpretation results partly from the fact that Black culture and humor may generally be officially interrupted or interpreted by non-Blacks or the Black middle class, groups who for different reasons insist upon literal mainstream interpretation of Black behavior. Folk tales and jokes collected in the late 19th century, however, reveal that despite the influence of minstrelsy, private Black humor maintained its ironic edge and assertiveness. As Osofsky points out, stories told by freedmen of this period often hark back to slavery and emphasize a common theme: the ascendancy of the trickster or the slave's ability to outwit his master. As we saw earlier, the old John tale collected during this period repeatedly demonstrate the theme of Blacks using deception, wit, and guile to dupe their master and avoid calamity. In one, old John the trickster is told by his master that he must fight the most powerful Black man on a nearby plantation. A few $1,000s have been wagered on him. At the battleground, John finds his opponent is a massive man who, chained to a stake, is growling and pawing at the ground like a wild animal. Instead of approaching his opponent, John approaches his master's wife and slaps her in the face. Witnessing this, his opponent quickly pulls up the stake and, terrified, runs away. The bet is fortified. Still, John's master is furious and demands that John justify his actions. Well, John replies, Jim knowed if I slapped a white woman, I'd kill him, so he ran. His master won the bet and rewarded John. In another, John has a passion for onions and each night sneaks into his master's garden to steal some. The master discovers that his vegetables are being stolen and tells John to catch the thief. A few days later, John brings in a skunk who he insists is the culprit. When his master reacts with disbelief, John says that if he doesn't believe the creature was the cook, he could smell the skunk's breath himself. Minstrel comic reference were almost surely subjected to the same double-edged interpretation that characterized the humor of Black slaves. Deception, irony, and an irreverent estimate of white affection and pretense no doubt continued as essential elements in a private humor of Blacks at the turn of the century, even as minstrel shows began to decline in popularity. On stage, however, the public ridicule of Blacks continued. Even after vaudeville supplanted minstrelsy as mainstream America's favorite form of popular entertainment, white performers still corked up and impersonated Blacks. Such luminaries as Buster Keaton, Eddie Cantor, Eddie Leonard, Mac and Morin, Freeman Gosden, and Charles Corral and Al Jolson all performed in blackface in vaudeville theaters and reworked some of the old minstrel bits. Black performers like Burt Williams, George Walker, Irvin C. Miller, Flowerny E. Miller, Ernest Hogan, and Butterbeans and Saucy and Susie also worked in blackface in vaudeville. And decades after B.F. Keith had opened what is considered the first authentic vaudeville house in Boston in 1882, when minstrelsy had vanished as a premier stage phenomenon, Black performers toured with traveling minstrel acts throughout the South, Midwest, and West, presenting shows that might have been performed at the height of the minstrel craze. Blackface entertainment, in fact, would survive well into the 20th century, even when it was not required by promoters and theater owners. Some Black comedians continued to use it. It was as if Black performers felt that comedy and burnt cork were inseparable. Pigmeat Markham, for example, worked in blackface until World War II, to after, World War II, when audiences and critics demanded that the burnt cork performances end. They were astonished to find that he was actually darker than the makeup he used. Black minstrelsy is a paradoxical element in Black entertainment history, stigmatized by critics. Its performers considered disreputable or worse, racial turncoats. It remains a cornerstone in the development of the Black performing arts. As W.C. Handy points out, it is the conduit for the passage of Black entertainers, but into the spotlight of the American stage. For more than half a century, it was practically the only way a Black performer could achieve recognition. And for nearly all of the illustrious Black performers who emerged in the early 20th century, from musicians to singers such as Handy, Bessie Smith, Ma Rainey, and Ubi Blank, to dancers and comics such as Bert Williams, Pig Meat Markham, Moms Mabley, Manton Moreland, Bill Bojangles Robinson, Josephine Baker, and Stephen Fetching. It was the proving ground on which their reputations were earned and from which their careers were launched. And that is the end of chapter 3. That is the end of chapter 3, section 3, Black Minstrelsy to Vaudeville. On the Real Side by Mel Watkins. A history of African American comedy from slavery to Chris Rock. That is the end of chapter 3, man. We have finished it. My reading was kind of choppy. Choppy. Let me see. I'll take it back. It might not be the end. I think I got another page. 133. No, that was the end. What it look like? Let me see. Yeah, I thought I had the pages stuck together. So, chapter 4, or the beginning of part 2, The Outside, African American comedy on stage, screen, and radio, will be in chapter 4, Vaudeville and early 20th century Black humor, the blackening of America. This is Flower Noah Miller and Aubrey Lyles in Shuffle Along, then Blackface. That's that contortion of the mouth right there. The contortioning of the mouth. Yeah, man, we'll come back next time and start off chapter 4. There's the cover pages. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 pages. It'll probably be about the same, about an hour read when I come back the next time, Lord willing. Didn't have many words to look up tonight, which is good. But On the Real Side by Mel Watkins. I hope that you have enjoyed the reading even though it was kind of choppy, but we pushed through it. One page at a time, one section at a time, one chapter at a time, till we finish the book and expand our minds. On the Real Side by Mel Watkins. So, if it's your first time, thank you for showing up. Continue to come on in, tell your friend, tell your kin, and we're going to keep pushing. But till next time, man, till next session of Reading with SHILO. SHILO out. I hope y'all have a wonderful night, wonderful evening, wonderful day, whenever you get to play back, man. Shalom. Shalom, everybody.